Claude McKay is a poet that many, including I now, appreciate, but just as many, if not more, tend to disagree on who he is. He's introduced most typically as a Harlem Renaissance writer, a radical poet, or the author of If We Must Die, which is the poem that established McKay as a major political poet and cornerstone of the Harlem Renaissance. This poem and Claude McKay's time in Harlem, his time as a Harlem writer, is what's most often talked about with him. I found myself trying to gain a different understanding as a whole, a lens so that I can understand not just his time in Harlem, but his time in Jamaica or his time in the Soviet Union or in different countries in Europe. And I found that a lot of the conversation often leaves out the most important detail in understanding all of his works, which is that he did not begin in Harlem. It's important to remember that Claude McKay was born in colonial Jamaica. He was raised under British rule and he was educated inside a system that dominated his country at the time. And in many ways, that very system that educated him became the system that he was trying to fight against. So, with that in mind, my goal is not to simplify Claude McKay, but it's to show why he resists simplification. And I hope that through this attempt at understanding his colonial upbringing and how that impacts all of his other writings, this can just be uh, one important part and gain a clear picture of who he is as a person and a writer and understand why he doesn't fit into these more simple labels like a Harlem writer or a political writer or just a radical figure. So, to start, in order to paint this clearer picture of Claude McKay and the influences played on him from a colonial upbringing, we'll give a quick background of his life and where he lived. Claude McKay was born in Clarendon Parish in Jamaica in 1889. At this point, Jamaica had been under British rule for over 200 years. McKay's older brother was his first teacher in life. Educating him in literature, philosophy, science, and theology, McKay was writing poetry by the time he was 10 years old. In 1906, McKay moves to Kingston, Jamaica. Here he works as a constable, which is a peace officer, but very quickly becomes disillusioned with his job as he experiences, witnesses, and takes part in urban racism. After a short stint, he moves back home to Clarendon Parish. It is around this time that McKay meets a man named Walter Jekyll, who would soon become his mentor. Jekyll encouraged him to focus on writing in his native dialect of a Jamaican patois. This new focus would eventually lead McKay to releasing his first wide-known literary works, Songs of Jamaica, in which he sticks to the original Jamaican dialect in his writing, though he would quickly abandon this style. Shortly after the release of these poems, in October 1912, McKay moved to the United States to go to Kansas State College to study agriculture. He quickly realized that this was not the path he wanted to take, and by 1914, he leaves college to move to Harlem, New York City. He works a series of menial jobs focused on writing poetry while he does so. Wherein by 1917, Claude McKay releases his first poems to come out of Harlem in America, The Harlem Dancer and The Invocation. Both of these poems ended up being included in McKay's poetry collection, Harlem Shadows. McKay spends the next 3 years traveling to England and then back to the United States, working for different journals, some as a socialist newspaper, one just a New York City magazine, until 1922. Claude McKay travels to the Soviet Union and attends the Fourth Congress of the Third Communist International in Moscow. Claude McKay was gladly and proudly accepted into the Soviet Union at the time for his work against what he saw as imperial forces, white forces, and capitalist forces. It was this same rebellion and focus that different communities, groups often accepted Claude McKay for, that often ended up to him being not a part of the group anymore, whether it's by them claiming it or him saying he no longer wants to be. We can see the beginnings of him recognizing this attitude in himself when he writes in 1918, I cease to think of people and things in the mass. One must seek for the noblest and best in the individual life only. Each soul must save itself. Now, with that and the general overview I've given, I just want to speak more specifically. When he's in Jamaica, as he starts, and he uses the original Jamaican dialect, he quickly runs into criticism of people within the system that he wants to please, which is British education, saying that he is not as a serious poet. These are sort of just like fun things or like expressions that can't be related to. So he reverts back. He starts going to the more original English structure that he was taught and that he grew up loving. He goes to Harlem, and he is successful in Harlem, and he is generally accepted. But the issue that I think he runs into in Harlem is in this time, all of the black creators, poets, musicians are really building up this culture that wasn't allowed to exist in a public domain beforehand. There's no exposure to it. And because this culture is being built, there are specific reference points that all of these artists are using in order to create a sort of cohesive picture. So they're referencing Jim Crow laws, and they're referencing slavery and the freedom of slavery. And it's all from a very American standpoint and what it means to be a Black American or an African American, which McKay, I think, never really saw himself as fully either of those things. I mean, of course, he's not an African American. He's not from Africa. He's from Jamaica. And even as a Black American, I think he found himself on the outskirts of the culture because everyone else is trying to build this cohesive thing where it can move together and challenge the dominant culture at the time. And then he goes to Europe. He just works on journalism there, but it's on a socialist newspaper, and then to the Soviet Union. And later in life, he falls out with the Soviet Union as well. He doesn't fit in completely. And he just runs into that everywhere he goes. His focus on black workers, that's what he wants to advocate for when he's there, as part of this greater picture that he thinks the international communists are trying to build. And he has so much fire in wanting to fix this and see change immediately for him and people around him that he ends up coming at odds with the people that are I guess he tried to work with. Because in his eyes and in his own words, not enough was being done to help the liberation of black people in the Americas or in the West. So why is this important? I want to say quickly that I got a lot of this lens that I'm applying here from a book, Claude McKay, The Literary Identity from Jamaica to Harlem and Beyond. And using this lens has allowed me to grow a deeper understanding and re-understand his poetry as I revisited it. And hopefully I've gave you a good enough understanding to where you now have a picture of his life and how to read Claude McKay before you interact with him. So with that being said, I will now play video where he will read off one of his own poems, and hopefully you go out and read more yourself.
The tropics in New York. Bananas ripe and green and ginger root, cocoa in pods and alligator pears, and tangerines and mangoes and grapefruit, fit for the highest prize at parish fairs. Set in the window, bringing memories of fruit trees laden by low-singing rills, and dewy dawns and mystical blue skies in benediction over nun-like hills. My eyes grew dim, and I could no more gaze. A wave of longing through my body swept, and hungry For the old familiar ways I turned aside and bowed my head and wept.